Hello everyone, today we talk about the Ukrainian cultural influence in the development of the Muscovy. So we have seen in the previous videos how the Union of Adyech, an attempt to introduce the Cossacks in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth political representation, was aborted. This brought as a consequence to the split of Ukraine 8 years later along the Dnieper River line between the Commonwealth and the Muscovy. This was formalized with the Treaty of Andrusovo. So this was coming at the end, as we have explained in the previous videos, of a great struggle that the Cossacks had put up within the Commonwealth and had brought to basically the severe weakening of the same at the hands of the same Cossacks that at some point caused some of the greatest massacres in modern Europe, but also of course the Swedish army, the Russian army, and it was a lost chance to instead consolidate the Commonwealth's power further with the introduction of Ukraine fundamentally as a third element nation, say. And more than that, it was really the struggle between the Republican idea that the Cossacks were not really against, that is properly the idea of a comparticipation of Ukraine in the Commonwealth, but rather a democratic one. The idea that the land, the latifundia question was not addressed, that the only Cossacks to join the union would have been the nobility, and the overwhelming majority of the rest would have fundamentally not received any other right. And this was because most of these people were just peasants, right? Differently from Poland and Lithuania, that had a much higher amount of gentry within their own community, and therefore also with Lithuania it was the minor power compared to Poland. Still, there was the respect, the constitutionally sanctioned, of such gentry prerogatives, and therefore a greater participation in the Commonwealth's policy and institutions. So, what happened in 1667 brought to literally a different age in the history of Eastern Europe, as fundamentally a great part of the country shifted under the control of the Tsars. And historiographically speaking, a lot has been said ever since regarding this, right? In later romantic nationalistic historiography, this unhinging, let's say, of part of Ukraine from the Commonwealth was seen as a sort of Ukrainian rebellion against the Polish oppressors, inflating the idea of the separation. In the previous videos, we've seen how this fundamentally was not an issue, right? They didn't really care. The leaders of the Cossack uprising, and also those who were fighting against them, were fundamentally both, let's say, Polish and Ukrainian, politically speaking, and they really didn't care much about that. On the contrary, Ukrainians were perfectly aware of the advantages that derived from the Commonwealth and from the rights that were still, contemplated by it, even some of them just in potential, but therefore attainable. So, from a Russian historiographical standpoint, of course, this event has been seen as the idea of Ukraine fundamentally entering the Russian orbit as a sort of, deterministic ideal, as you can imagine, and so on. And we've seen also in the previous videos instead how this was fundamentally also another lie in the measure in which banally Ukrainians understood Polish, spoke Polish in their own negotiations with the Commonwealth. They didn't need translators. When they called the Russians against the Poles and the Lithuanians, they needed the Muscovy dialect to be translated in Latin, and then, given that they had been learning this language from the Polish Jesuits, to eventually be able to understand what this meant. And they were still Eastern Slavs linguistically, but that tells you by that point which was the degree of integration of Ukraine within the Commonwealth compared to Muscovy, that was just emerging such as a considerable power, not really having played any role up to that point in Ukrainian culture and identity. And the opposite would actually happen, as we will see in this video. So what is more fruitful, let's say, to observe at this point, in fact, is how Ukraine essentially bridged Muscovy with Western culture, especially in the fields of politics and religion. The Cossacks that were gradually absorbed into the Tsarist orbit were, as we've seen, well aware and grounded in the realities of the Commonwealth. So what they were doing at this point was essentially thinking that they could still retain some negotiable power in between, as a kind of a peripheral condition. Still cooperating, in fact, with Muscovy at this point, remembering that just a part of the country was, by the way, and especially the one that in fact was less Polonized and also less developed. So the Ukrainians up to that point were aware of the fact that even though they had been complaining about the inequality that the Polish had generated in Ukraine, but were still presuming the existence of rights being protected within the Commonwealth. And this in fact was showed by the Article 3 of the 1654 Pereyaslav alliance, with which they had decided to support Muscovy, by specifying as Cossacks that, albeit supporting the Muscovites, they would still retain for themselves the right they had enjoyed, quote, under the Polish king. So this shows you, from one side, how fluid their situation was politically in the frontier, but at the same time, how much they still thought of themselves by that point as properly protected by the Polish king, that, let's remember, it had properly incorporated within the Polish kingdom within the Commonwealth Ukraine territory. So the big differences between Ukraine and Moscow were immediately evident at that point, because albeit Cossacks and Muscovites were both Orthodox, and we've seen how the Cossacks had fundamentally fought for just pure Orthodoxy without the idea of the reunion of the two churches that had been enforced up to the 1630s in the Commonwealth from the Brest Union, 1596. The Muscovite and the Ukrainian churches were very different. Also, their mindset was politically, because the Cossacks were not really fighting to impose any kind of orthodoxy beyond the boundaries of their own people. They were aware and accepting of the idea that within the Commonwealth, different faiths, different Christian faiths at least, could exist coexist, in fact, on an equal ground, and that this could not fundamentally be touched, right? That's what they were fighting for having their own church recognized on equal ground, and without thus any idea of, let's say, making other churches or confessions for that matter, given that some of them had also converted to Protestantism and so on, let's say, disappear, because properly was not within their horizons. Moscow at this point had a completely different mindset, because there the church was utterly subordinated to the state. Like, not even the Byzantine tradition had reached certain levels of autocracy and of subjugation of the church under secular power. The Tsars traditionally imprisoned, sometimes even executed, the Orthodox authorities, right? And this was a degree of brutality unconceivable within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, never been seen, right? It would have served no purpose. Here we should digress, explaining we made videos about the rise of Muscovy and how, you know, the thing took form and from which background, etc. So the cultural differences in that sense are readily explained. There is a playlist about medieval Russia. You can look at that. But it's obvious, and this is the idea. This was a ferociously autocratic regime that had stemmed, after all, just a couple of centuries before, fundamentally from Mongol vassalage and political institutional models. And that simply, you know, even if you consider it from a geographical point of view and the communications of the time and the general international situation, had remained fundamentally cut from most of Western development, and considered it had kept expanding importantly in Siberia, so in directions that, of course, by enlarging Moscow's power, had, of course, brought the same to be ever more in contact with the West, but still with a degree of backwardness and general, you know, very peculiar features that were fundamentally unknown in the West. And this was especially true from a cultural point of view, meaning that the Tsars were essentially a militaristic, imperialistic regime already. The letters, the culture, education were not particularly developed, not even compared to Central and Eastern European standards of the time. So what the integration of parts of Ukraine brought to Muscovy was definitely actually a great opening to Western ideas and development in the first place. Muscovy inherited, together with Kyiv, Orthodox clergy that had been habituated within the Commonwealth to the controversies of the Reformation, of the Counter-Reformation, the union of the two churches. So that had, in spite of the condition of minority, especially in power, of the Orthodox Church and the Union, in a way that had made the Old Rus Church developing, updating dramatically in all those properly theoretical, ideological, rhetorical means that were necessary to struggle in that situation with dramatically more modern ideas and means, right? Properly, this is not much about the idea of technology of printing press per se. This is properly the availability of scholars, of people who have a solid structure education, that they are, enough numerically to make a difference in a country, also is able to receive these ideas and so on. And if you know just how hard it was to modernize Russia, think about Peter the Great and so on, the incredible reactionarism and that the Tsarist reforms encountered, this was a big challenge, right? And in fact, the Ukrainian clergy would be particularly instrumental to this, right? Think about Peter the Great, Patriarch. Some of them were properly from Ukraine, right? And they were put there because they were much more open-minded and modern, and would enact those reforms that eventually would build what we know as modern Russia, properly created along Western models. Consider that at the time of the Ukrainian incorporation by the Tsars, Moila's Kyiv Academy was the largest educational center in the Tsar's domains, because properly there was nothing else outside of that scale. The same can be said of the colleges of Chernihiv and Kharkiv, and these centers provided classical education along with the Baroque lines of the time. We're talking about mostly Latin and Polish literature that was educating tens of thousands of Eastern Slavic students. Jan Kochanowski, the magnificent poet of the Polish Renaissance, was the model taken in these institutions for compositions. The Polish models of versifying prevailed in Eastern Europe as it was being absorbed by the Muscovy during the 18th century, because properly these were pouring via Ukraine largely. And such academies, founded to originally within the Commonwealth to defend orthodoxy from Catholicism, were also close in contact with Protestant Europe, and therefore with ideas that were even more advanced, progressive, compared to, at that point, was Catholic country, the age of Counter-Reformation, and so on. So for 150 years to come, Ukrainian schools provided Moscow and St. Petersburg with doctors, journalists, civil servants, and it was not until, in fact, Kyiv entered the Tsarist dominions that Moscow began to translate books in large numbers, properly in its literary and philological history. The source languages were Greek, Latin, and Polish, and the translators for these languages were clergymen from Ukraine, from the lands of the former lands of the Commonwealth. So this posed Moscow and its dialect to confront with not just this other Eastern Slavic, but also Western Slavic and rest of European cultures, literatures that were dramatically more developed than whatever had existed in Russia at that point. So in this way, the process of Russian modernization was dramatically enhanced, because without Kyiv, the intellectual tools and cultural resources required for such transformation would have difficultly been so available. It doesn't matter how much this thing could happen from the external, right? This was now properly a center of culture within the Tsarist domains, as it had never happened before. And this process had a dramatic importance in the definition of Russian modern identity, because all what concerned the Muscovite claims about the Byzantine patriarchal, metropolitic, universal legacy within Orthodoxy were practically consolidated only thanks to Ukrainian clergymen. Up to this point, Moscow had not had the means, but at that point probably not even the interest to impose this idea, let's say, given what was its own social segmentation and the degree of international relations. And to properly impose this view. In spite of these claims, Moscow, in fact, had fundamentally had very limited cultural connections with Constantinople historically. So trying to embody that legacy was something awkward, and aside from the, ambiguous means through which he had properly claimed the patriarchal authority and the same Moscow and so on. So the authors in Russian history properly that made the whole thing, work till our days, and this idea that fundamentally Russia would own partly the legacy as a third, with Moscow the third Rome, etc. So in fact said Kyiv in first place, was actually created by Kievan churchmen. That up to that point, they had never even properly considered Moscow as the center of Orthodoxy. Up to that point, they were just adapting to the situation of the second half of the 17th century, because basically they were working for the Tsars, and so they began to fabricate the story. So as we have seen, also they provided properly the manpower, the retinues for Patriarch Nikon, for example, modernization of the Orthodox Church, later for the reforms of Peter the Great. So what was operated throughout this was the creation properly of a consolidation of the link between church and state in the Muscovy. Even up to that point had been, in fact, as we have seen, those strains with the same church were still having kind of, brutal relations in a way. So it was important for the same Tsarist stability to consolidate the bond. And after the Treaty of Andrusovo, this was done by Ukrainians essentially to maintain their own position, given that it was an Ukrainian churchman who came up with the idea of the transfer of the Kievan princely seat to Moscow, which would eventually be spread by the Russian national myth and historiography. Can argue that it was actually Kyiv that invented Russian history. In the 70s of the 17th century, the scholars of the Kyiv Academy were ideologists of the new regime, and the most cultured ones. So the ones on whom the burden of that creation actually falls. In these ways, the absorption of eastern Ukraine in the second half of the 17th century brought properly to the definition of Russia altogether as the territory of Muscovy within properly the imperial idea of Russia. It was a Ukrainian invention, the same concept of Great Russia, that is Muscovy, Little Russia, Ukraine, and White Russia, Belarus. This, especially the latter concept, especially was known since previous times, but let's say the idea that the Russian lands under the control of the Tsars would effectively be a wall and say subdivided in this fashion, especially the idea of the Great and the Little Russia that up to that point was really not there, was invented in Kyiv by Ukrainian churchmen. And so this idea also of the idea of the Great Russia, right? So Moscow, and that's where the power comes from. And Little Russia as Ukraine is fundamentally a creation of the same Ukrainian intelligentsia working for the Tsars. And this is interesting because this process of acculturation is essentially the same one that had happened within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, that, as we have seen, had brought to the properly the acculturation, this civilization of Lithuania by the Ruthenians, by the old Rus, that with its Ukrainian center was fundamentally the most culturally advanced area of the Dutch in the same way, right? So these political concepts, as you know, would have an enormous impact in modern history, because that's essentially how we still reason through, and that's how they acquired also their nationalistic load, and all what we see still today with properly the realization that, I don't know, what the whole the question is about Russia and Ukraine, that of course at this point in history do share something, and this is independently from what let's say what the political allegiance is, because we've seen how quickly it has shifted from 2014 to now, regarding the idea of being part of Russia and what was the common Soviet history, and the disasters that were, and the genocide actually was perpetrated in Ukraine and so on. But in general, this idea would in fact be resumed in part also by some Ukrainian nationalism. Think about even the republic that was being created at the end of the Tsarist Empire, etc. That stressed the fact that still there was a cooperation with Russia, that the two peoples were one. But if you scratch the surface and the contingential political necessities of the time, it must be understood in their context, of course. You realize that this whole idea of Russia and how it was formed properly historically, it's something that, at least in the way we see now in modern terms, is properly a fabrication of not more than essentially 300 years ago. And the question, of course, is also the rapidity of the spread of the Russian Empire, and also the shrinking, if not properly the canceling of such enormous, a gigantic entity territorially like the one of the Commonwealth, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, etc. It's something that has redrawn boundaries, but of course cannot erase what the previous historical reality and cultural identities and really were, right? So this would open to also a much more complicated assessment that I hope we will get in the details of, regarding properly how this awareness has been eventually cancelled in some ways, because it's obvious that in the Tsarist Empire, when the general all the difficulties and the struggles, the rebellions, eventually the same Russian Revolution, and eventually the Soviet Union have, and what the socio-economical background of most of these people were, could not really spread in-depth historical awareness about all these things. And that's of course what has been played on politically, also to make us believe, in fact, that these lands were somewhat, the other day there was a guy that I blocked. Normally I block because when there is something that doesn't really sound right for my moral adjustment, let's say, such as, you can't root for a country that does not exist, right? I have a very different idea of what a country is. Speaking of Ukraine, right? When I was making that video about Ukrainian resistance and all, and these are provocations, and I frankly don't care. I mean, it's not a problem. But the question is, what is a nation, right? And a nation is to be seen in the moment in which there is a people that is united against a foreign invasion, right? Without provocation, that is using, by the way, barbaric means to impose in fact, all what is this ideological load without basically any kind of historical foundation whatsoever, right? If Ukraine is not a country just because, so what, Poland was not a country because it was cancelled at some point from the political maps. Well, this has nothing to do with what a country is, right? And this is said by a person that can limpidly say that they have always been interested in Russian history and culture. They really don't have a negative prejudice towards it. In fact, I don't even think what is happening right now in terms of Russophobia is really helpful to properly kick the Russians out of Ukraine, because it's not much of what they can do otherwise. But let's say it's for anybody else, including the same Russians that are fighting for Ukraine, because notoriously, you know, that there are Russian Ukrainians in there at this point. They're there, as much as many Russians that are against the war and so on, that are getting imprisoned and so on. Like, we have to start from a standpoint that is fair towards everybody, that is not discriminatory for the sake of, you know, we don't like these guys now because yeah, okay, they screwed up, they're countered with dramatic cultural historical problems. We all know it, but at the same time recognizing also what in fact this country stems from. I think it's a first step properly to hopefully have a limpid understanding of many other things that are going on. So the idea that the Russian identity, in a way, it's from, let's say, in the modern sense, was a fabrication stemming mostly actually from the Ukrainian intelligentsia, in a moment in which Muscovy was, of course, culturally backwards compared to the lands of the old Rus, is actually a pretty important assessment to make at this point in history, because much of also the support that Russia enjoys and all these things, it does stem from the complete ignorance of Westerners in Eastern European history in the first place, that Russia is a myth, right? The great part of the reasons why there are so many Westerners that are supporting Putin, and even aside from this war, like for ever since, right, the thing was something, are reasons that we can explain easily, that are of course nested within the problems of you know, each of the people's country that we're taking consideration, but they rely grossly on this complete misassessment and misrealization of what Russia historically, culturally, and more, it fundamentally is. And that is, in fact, instead a surprisingly compact idea in the minds of these people. And this is, again, like any country's identity has been fabricated. But, you know, it depends also on how it's being fabricated. So I thought that this video was quite interesting because it's showing how properly Muscovy became Russia just because of some Ukrainian scholars in a time in which Russia invades Ukraine, denying basically its you know, claiming that it was essentially a Russian creation. It's quite ironic from a historical standpoint, and should, I think, wake a bit of people up, just even if they were already in favor of Ukraine at this point in the situation. So we will keep talking about this. For today we stop here, and we'll see you next time.